Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Advocata Studio to discuss about reshaping public ownership and the future of state-owned enterprises reforms. As you can see and as you have seen, most of the presidential candidates have mentioned what they are going to do with the state-owned enterprises, which also indicates the gravity of the problem and need for reform. Joining with me today is Mr. Manjula De Silva, the past CEO of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. He also sits in multiple corporate sector boards. Manjula, welcome to Advocata Studio and for this podcast. Thank you very much for joining with us today.
Yeah, hi, Dhananath. Thanks for inviting me. Lovely to be here.
Manjula, just wanted to understand now, on state-owned enterprises reforms, you have engaged for quite a long time. Why don't you first start with what was your engagement with state-owned enterprises reforms? What's the history? Share some thoughts about that first to begin with.
Right, yeah, it goes a long way back. I've always had this fascination with this subject, so which made me take up the position of Director General PERC, way back in 2002, I believe, 2002 or 3. So for a short period of about 9 months, I held that position. So that was my first experience with state enterprise reform. And then back again, more recently, during 2016-17 period, there was this Ministry of Public Enterprise Development established. So they also started on a SOE reform agenda. And I was invited to become an advisor to the government, to that ministry. So I had a second stint in trying to push this agenda forward. In between, of course, I've been in chamber, in various committees, etc. So always been an advocate of SOE reforms.
So just to ask you, is there an alternative for SOE reforms? I mean, alternative in the sense there are multiple solutions have been discussed in terms of improving governance, privatizations, public-private partnerships, bringing it under a holding company. There have been so many solutions being in discussion. What is, are there any, and also there's some in the view, the state should engage and also do it. Rather than reforming it, is there any other alternative solution with your 20 or I don't know, many years of experience?
Not really, Dhananath. I mean, I feel they all need some form of reform. Of course, when you say reform, it's not it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of remedy. There are multiple options. But they all need reform for different reasons, right? Now, when you look at SOEs, I mean, this is a very diverse set of entities we are talking about, They're not all the same. And they would require reform for different reasons. Now, if you take one set of companies which are like the, larger utilities. Now, these have a challenge of offering what is an essential product or a service, right, at an affordable cost to the public and to businesses, and at the same time ensuring that they are profitable and they maintain their financial stability. But they have been struggling to do that, right? Now, if you see, I mean, until very recently, many of them were running at a huge loss, right? Because they were underpricing, right? Now they have switched to cost-reflective pricing, and because of that, profitability has improved. But now what has happened is the prices are way beyond what can be considered affordable to both the public and the businesses. So there is a challenge there, right? So which requires some form of reform. Maybe in the form of market liberalization or unbundling, various options are being considered. Now that's one set, but there's another set which are in various other non-strategic sectors which are profitable, right? Which is something a lot of people don't realize. Actually, if you study the SOEs, about 2/3 of them are profitable, right? But, and some people think, if you're profitable, then there is no need for reform. But I feel these also need reform because the government doesn't have the ability to keep on investing more capital to optimize the return on these assets, right? So, I mean, like if you take an example now, if you take a hotel, right, that will require continuous refurbishment, right? If it's a factory, it will require, modernization of plant, systems, and so on, right? Plantations require fertilizer and other inputs, right? And the government doesn't have funds to, keep on injecting into these businesses. So as a result, although you might say it's profitable, the return on assets is really far below the optimal levels, right? So it makes more sense for the government to get out of these sectors and either fully or partially privatize and realize some funds, right? Generate some funds that can be used for other priorities. I mean, right now, the government is cash strapped. They need funds for salaries, pensions, welfare payments, to invest in other priority sectors like health and education, right? So why, be spending money refurbishing hotels or modernizing machinery in a non-strategic venture?
So, Manjula, I think many people have the question, especially on the sector that you first mentioned, which is the public utilities, electricity, water, telco to an extent, whether by running it by the government, whether they could afford, they could provide the service at an affordable rate for people. But from the little business that I know, generally when you take a risk or when you invest your money or reputation or anything in any form to a business, you get that natural tendency to recover it, which drives you to basically improve the efficiency or the productivity, because you are going to lose something out if you do not act on it. But when it's someone else's money, and if you have a free way of, like in a monopoly, that you can increase the prices every time that your cost base is increasing, of course it's end up on the public's side with very high cost of public utilities. So how do you manage it? Because one main concern was on the transportation at the same time, on the public transportation. We'll investigate a little bit in deep on transportation, but how do you solve that issue? If you allow the public enterprises to run by the government, of course they don't have the prices, there's a higher chance it will go up. But if you allow the private sector to come, it's very difficult, because you cannot have like 10 electricity lines to your home where you pick one. So how do you solve that issue?
I think the way to go is really to introduce competition, wherever it is possible. Of course, I mean, there are certain limitations, right? When it comes to, say, electricity, the transmission, for example, is one area where, it may not be possible to introduce competition. But you can introduce competition at the generation point, and even at the point of distribution, there are models, right, which can be used. Now, petroleum, right? Now, petroleum, actually, you don't really need to privatize the petroleum corporation, but you can bring in competition, right? And that will then make sure that even the petroleum corporation cannot dictate the price at its will. They will have to be efficient if they are to match the competition. So, which is what is currently happening, right? So, I mean, there are ways in which you can address these issues, right? And maybe privatization is not always the remedy. You can have state institutions operating in competition with the private sector. Now, see what happened in the case of telecom, right? At one time, they were a monopoly, right? So they didn't care, and people had to wait in queues to get a telephone line, right? But the moment they introduced competition, right, then it became a different story. I mean, today telecom doesn't operate like a state entity anymore, right? So I think the key there is to open these markets to competition as much as possible. And okay, then whether you want to sort of keep some of these entities under state ownership or whether you want to divest completely, it's a different issue. That again, one has to see like case by case, whether there's a case to do that or not.
Let's move to public transport, because I think that's a pressing concern for a lot of people. Even if you drive your own vehicle, you're not happy with the traffic, the time that you spend at road. So there are quite a lot of challenges. So, and also it comes back to a complaint that okay, earlier it was the CTB, which was the main transport provider when it comes to like the land roads, and now we've privatized it, and now look at the status of the public transport. Buses are like they are racing in like narrow roads, and there's no timetable, service is poor. It's the same Leyland bus that we saw 20 years, it's still operating. So what actually has happened? What's your diagnosis on this issue?
Actually, Dhananath, I think transport has been a heavily neglected sector in this country. You know, I mean, there's been very little reform in the area of transport, right? I remember about 20 years ago, there was an attempt to privatize the CTB, right? And but then that also got abandoned because there were issues with the process. Somebody went to courts and
Right.
work decided to close the process. But I don't think privatization is needed there, right? Now, here, if you take bus transport initially, I mean, what you need to do is to change the operating model completely. You know, this current method of having so many people owning one or two buses running in competition with each other, I mean, that is a crazy way to run a bus transportation system. What you need to do is introduce something like a route franchising system, where for each route you select one operator, right? And then that operator will be required to operate according to a predetermined timetable and according to certain terms and conditions. And you select the operator through a competitive tender process, right? So there is competition, right? But you take the competition off the road, right? Competition should not be on the road where, like, each bus is trying to fight with each other. And they're not rocket science, right? I mean, the other day I took a bus and went to Gaul on the expressway, and I noticed this is what is happening there, right? Because there are just one or two operators, CTB, plus I came in a private bus on the return from Gaul to Colombo, and I noticed that this is run by a bus owners association, right? So they have grouped together and they are operating as a single entity. And there's absolute discipline, right? Buses are running according to a pre-scheduled timetable. They're not fighting with each other to get passengers. They leave at the time that is scheduled, regardless of whether the bus is full or not. So why can't we apply the same model to every route?
So probably, just to understand, so probably that means that bus association, they run according to the timetable. So whatever the collection, they may be dividing it across the owners or the shareholders of the association.
Yeah, I believe they're formed into like a company.
Yeah.
So maybe the profits are shared,
Okay.
among the different owners.
Otherwise, the bus driver feels if he's the owner, you delay it to wait for a few more passengers to get in, and then your entire schedule goes for a 6.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So what works in many countries in the world, they have tried this. So where you have one single operator, let's say on the 138 route or 176 route, and then they are not competing with another operator on that route. Right? So you agree on a price, right? So there are different ways, like, so when you have a competitive tender, so the one who offers to run for the lowest fare per kilometer will get the job, right? Of course, there may be certain uncommercial or commercially unviable routes, right? In which case, some kind of subsidy
Has to be given.
So that is understood, right? But then you pick the party who agrees to run for the lowest subsidy, right? So that way, in whichever way, whatever is most economical, you can select, and then you make sure that this party operates according to a given time schedule, and subject to other conditions, like, so there has to be a maximum number of passengers that you can carry, and you have to run at all times, like, so even at, say, 10 o'clock in the night or 11 o'clock in the night, if there's a need, you have to run the bus, even with one or two passengers, right? Now today, what happens is, you have buses, too many buses at certain times, after a particular time, the buses are non-existent. And see the impact that has on the rest of the economy. I mean, why do shops close up so early in the night, right? Because they can't keep their employees. And if they do, they have to send them by private transport, which is very expensive, right? And people don't frequent these places beyond a time because unless you have a car, you can't step out after 6 p.m., right? So, a lot of issues that other sectors have will get resolved if you fix transport.
But now the challenge is, Manjula, to slowly, because we are not starting on a fresh page. It is already there's route permits, and a lot of people have invested a lot of money on buying those route permits. Any thoughts on how to slowly like transform? Whether are we going to allow the same owners to come together like what you have seen in the Southern Expressway? And also I think our fleet also needs to upgrade. What we use as like the non-air condition or the normal service is pretty much like a lorry structure that being with a chassis, and that has been with seats being fixed. We are using as a bus, which is not actually a bus, which is a lorry body that you are using as a bus. That's the truth. So any thoughts on actually a slow transformation? Because then whoever, because there's a general election coming, there are multiple elections coming, at least for our policymakers to pick some ideas on how to do this.
Yeah, absolutely right. Actually what we have called buses are not buses, they're actually lorry chassis with the body fixed. And in fact, somebody the other day commented in an article that we are, in reference to Colombo, that we are trying to have a world-class city with third world transport, right? Because that two things are poles apart. Today at least in Colombo roads are getting improved, buildings are coming up, but the transport is still at such a primitive state. But this is something that can be addressed, Dhananath. I think you have to engage with the bus owners, because today the current system is not beneficial to them as well. They are struggling, right? Just operating a bus, one bus or two, right, and finding the money to meet their lease commitments, to get the petrol, to pay the employees. Most of these people are struggling, right? But if you introduce a model like what I have suggested, I think they will realize that all of them can make more money, right? And operate a much more safer, reliable system. So it's a matter of engaging. I think this is what has been lacking also in all these reform exercises that we have undertaken so far. Because you have to look at each and every stakeholder. Now, if you take the transport area, you have to understand there are so many different stakeholders. The bus owners, the drivers, the conductors, the passengers, then the CTB employees. They will wonder what will happen to us. So I feel CTB also should be allowed to bid as another operator, so they can maybe run certain routes. Maybe for some routes private sector may not come forward, they can do so, but we must make them understand they also will have a role to play, otherwise there will be so much of opposition. So if you address each group of stakeholder and engage with them, I think we can come up with a model, and you can see it works, right? So the expressway is a good example where they have found a way, and that is helping everybody.
And now the system is no one is happy, neither the passengers, nor the drivers, nor the owners, because I saw the Bus Owners Association recently said that most of their operators and their members are basically dropping out. They are selling their buses off, and then they are going for different other employment opportunities. So thanks, Manjula, for that insights. Moving back to okay, we spoke about the public transportation, but on other reforms on the state-owned enterprises, there's general criticism is about, okay, these privatizations or reforms fail often than it succeeds. What's your take on that? And do you want to pinpoint with your experience, with your analysis, what are the cases that we have done well, what are the reasons for failures, and how it has affected overall in Sri Lanka or in other parts of the world, how this has been the case?
I know there's a general perception like that, Dhananath, but actually if you really look back, I don't agree that privatization has failed in Sri Lanka, because if you take the period from 1989 to 94, there have been 42 privatizations, right? Then 94 to 2004, that is after PERC was established, another 42 were privatized. So altogether 84 privatizations spanning so many different sectors, from financial services to plantations, manufacturing, hotels, right? Lot of entities have got privatized, and if you look at them, I will not mention names, but you will find that, I mean, they are running very well, adding value to customers, employees, everybody. Nobody is complaining, but we have just forgotten about them, because it probably happened a long time ago,
and also probably they are operating well, so people even don't realize whether it's a privatized entity
absolutely,
or like
absolutely. Today's younger generation, I think, don't even know that some of these were state entities at one time. Right?
Do you want to mention few examples? So, I mean, without tarnishing any brand names, but to show, because then people might think, oh, really, was this a privatized entity, to understand?
So I'll give a few examples. The INSEE Cement, I mean, that was one time a cement corporation, right? And then if you take the hotels like, Cinnamon Lakeside, Cinnamon Grand, I mean, all of these were state
Those
entities.
State hotels.
The Distilleries Corporation. I mean, I can tell you many examples, right, from different fields. A lot of these ceramics, the tiles, all these companies, wall tiles, all of them were state-owned entities, right? But today, I mean, they are operating as private sector entities, and I don't see anybody complaining that they got a bad deal. There have been a few failures also, right, from time to time. Failures in two ways. In some cases, I think some got reversed due to court actions, right, and got revested back in government. And then there were some which, after privatization, failed as businesses, went into liquidation. But if you really do a proper study, I think Advocata should do a study on this. I would invite you to do a deep study, successes and failures. You will realize there were few failures, and also maybe understand what went wrong. In my opinion, the failures happened, I mean, not because privatization is bad as a strategy or principle, but there were procedural flaws in some of these, I mean, they didn't really follow a transparent process. Maybe in some cases, there weren't enough bidders, so they just, went for whoever who came forward. So there were issues, but very few.
Excellent. So Manjula, on the failures, you mentioned about the bidders and sometimes the valuation processes, things like that may be the concern. And there's also some global cases are also being now dragged into this entire story. Okay, the British, some of their probably the privatizations are being reversed. So, and you mentioned about the two court cases we had, I think in particular with the Lanka hospitals, which was mainly happened with the reversal of the transaction with the Sri Lanka Insurance Corporation. So what we should, I mean, just to understand the structure of how we need to do it, because you were at PERC, which had, I think, the power or authority to facilitate those transactions. And now afterwards, there was the public enterprise ministry during Yahapalana government, and this interim government had a state-owned enterprises restructuring reform unit. What is the structure actually? Is it required a different structure, or how do you? And there, even in the IMF governance diagnostics, they have suggested like a holding company. So slowly, then the SOERU basically taking over this, not the SOERU, but they will appoint separate board of directors like a holding company, and then the rest, the governance structure moves forward. How should we structure this?
Yeah, I mean, there are alternate structures that are possible, Dhananath. So one is like, okay, a PERC type of unit or something like the SOE restructuring unit that is currently operating under the Ministry of Finance is a good sort of entity to drive the privatizations. I mean, if you're doing a divestment, you need somebody to, coordinate that process. But at the same time, I mean, like I mentioned earlier also, privatization is not the
only solution.
Right? So there may be certain entities which can remain under the government, but with better governance and better performance management practices put in place. So these, I think now the world over, what people have done is they have brought these under a single entity, a single independent commercially operated entity. Now, one big problem we have today, apart from everything else, is that these SOEs are operating under different line ministries. And under the act under which these SOEs are governed, the boards are appointed by the minister. Right, so minister
because
can,
it's under separate act, because railway is under a separate act, petroleum is under separate act. Yes,
railway is worse actually, because railway is still a department,
right.
right? Not even a corporation, right?
Right.
So that is at the other end. But even where it's a corporation or a government-owned company, the board is often appointed by the by the minister. So then, a lot of political interference, because once somebody is appointed by a minister and then the minister wants certain things done, then that person is always under obligation, right? Whereas now, if you can have a holding company, which is state-owned but independently run, right, with a professional board of directors, then you can sort of basically screen the SOEs from political interference, because they will then be reporting to this holding company, right? So you can have much better governance, and then you get the holding company to appoint their directors. That also maybe the first set of directors can be done that way. And then, like in the case of the private sector companies, you have a nominations committee drawn from the board itself, and every time there's a vacancy, the nominations committee can appoint a replacement. So like that, you take that political interference out of the system, right? So that is something which is very important. And unfortunately, now there was a bill that was drafted. Actually, this is the second time, right?
Is it?
Yeah. A similar bill was drafted and during the Yahapalana government, but that also didn't go through, right? I mean, it was 90% done, right? And then back again, the same exercise we have gone through, and but we haven't seen even the color of it. I mean, public has not seen, but actually there is a document done, right? So, we need that political will also to go through some of these things, Dhananath. I mean, you have to have the conviction that this is the way to go, and the ability to convince others, right? And go forward, because otherwise, I mean, we are wasting a lot of time doing a lot of things, bringing it to that 90th percentile or whatever, and then dropping it. Now see, even the current exercise, right? I mean, it started very well, right? And they advertised, they selected transaction advisors, then the transaction advisors basically, called for proposals, investors came forward. In some cases, they have selected an investor, but still, we don't see that final step being taken, and it's very likely that we'll be starting this all over again, wasting so much of time and resources.
So we are also coming to the final stages of our podcast, Manjula. So what can be done? Because as you mentioned, now when this cycle repeats multiple times, it takes like probably about 1 or 2 decades, and then that is more than enough for us to go for a massive fiscal imbalance, because as you said, these institutions requires capital if they really want to be in the business. Otherwise they'll start incurring losses, and that losses being passed to the common citizens, or through taxes, or in whatever the possible form. So what we should do actually to avoid this? Do you have any thoughts with your experience, how we should structure it, how we should do it? What is the critical thing that we need to do? Is it the bill that people should focus and bring it first, or is it the slow divestments or structures? What actually has to happen?
It's a combination of things, So the bill is very important to take care of whatever entities that are going to remain under the government, right? But then also some of the other measures, like to coming back to those large utilities, some of the liberalizations that started, taking place. So those have to be continued. The Electricity Act, for example, needs to get implemented. So like that, different actions are required. And then also the divestments. What was started, I mean, if even after the presidential election, regardless of who's in power, if they can, just evaluate the process carried out so far, Has it been done professionally? Has it been done transparently? Okay, then if so, continue, right? If not, rectify. But just because somebody else did it, if you just every time there's a change of government, and unfortunately sometimes even when within a government the ministers change, we tend to throw the entire process out and start again, right? So this is why we have been kind of taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right, kind of thing for so many years, and spent a lot of time doing a lot of things, but not completing, which is the unfortunate thing, and when I look back, some of the work we did like about 20 years ago at work, right, and we are repeating now, right? And whereas say if that was continued, where would we have been today, right? And we would probably not have been having this conversation, right? And there would have been hardly any SOEs to talk about, or whatever there was, they would have been running well, right? So that's an unfortunate situation. So coming back to conclude on this particular point, I think we have to ensure that always we follow a very transparent, well-structured process, and we need to get the buy-in of everybody, all the stakeholders. There has to be a well thought out plan of action. I think one instance where this was done was SLT. You must have heard the story how they reached out to employees and even the employees' families, right? They went that far, right, and made sure that everybody was brought on board, right, and that's how they got the support and went through with it. So likewise, I mean, you have to, you can't just try to bulldoze your way, right, and also when there's criticism, often what happens is the criticism comes in and you back out, right? Either you try to bulldoze through or you back out, but both are not the right way to go. I think you have to just take that criticism on and try to clarify, explain, make people understand the truth, right? Because often what you hear in social media and all the rest, it is not the real truth, so but unless the truth is out, people will not know it, right? So you have to really spend a lot of time and effort on communication and get winning over everybody, including the public, making people understand that this has to be done.
Manjula, to wrap up, since you mentioned about SLT, any other case studies in your, because you mentioned about there's 82 has been done, and I'm sure you may have engaged in a few. Do you want to bring out the good cases on the process? Because on the SLT one, I don't think anyone has sort of concerns, complaints. Even there were, I think, complaints at the beginning, but I think everyone knows it was transformed well, and it is providing a better service. But I think still the areas for improvement. Do you want to highlight any particular cases comes to your mind that you think it would be value for our audience?
I would hesitate to sort of mention a particular case, Dhananath, without really sort of studying the process involved. But by way of outcomes, if you look back at a lot of these, I mean, you find that the entities did not have any issues post privatization. There was no criticism. The employees were well on board, right? And there were no questions about whether the government got the right price or not, right? So that is where I feel somebody should do a proper study. I can help. I mean, I have a lot of information I can share with you. The PERC annual reports carry a lot of information of what happened those days. I mean, the interesting point also I want to make is that, see, if you take the period from 89 to 94 and 94 to 2004 spans 2 different governments, right, from 2 different political parties on either side of the political divide, right? So 94 I see as a very crucial year where government changed, but the policy did not, right? And so that was nice, right? I mean, they improved upon the previous policy because there was no PERC, there were some issues about transparency. They fixed those and continued, right? So that is the kind of I think approach that we need today, and I'm sure there are a lot of success stories we can pick out, but I would hesitate to name anyone because I haven't really sort of studied them in recent times that closely. Thank you very much, Manjula, for joining with us today to discuss about state-owned enterprises reforms and the future of it. And thank you very much for your attention.
And we will see you again on a similar podcast. Advocata Institute is a independent, non-partisan research institute and a think tank, and we analyze on a lot of public policy issues which affects your life and your finances and your economy and the country's economy. Please subscribe us. Advocata Institute is our English channel. Advocata Plus is our Sinhala channel, and also we are present in Tamil, where you can find us on Advocata Kural on YouTube and in all social media platforms. So please subscribe and follow us, so then you will get the updates on what we discuss and on our latest research content. Thank you very much.